All right, everybody. I think we are live. I'm going to just pull over the screen here. Uh, Says we're live. Let's see what's going on. Everybody, how's everybody doing tonight? Another episode of Shimano School. My name is JP DeRose. I'm joined by Keith Combs from the BASS Elite Series. If you haven't seen what Keith has been doing lately, he's actually fishing Pickwick this week. Correct, Keith?
That's correct, JP. We're here. We have Toyota Series Championship, and yeah, it's your typical fall deal. It's kind of that tough grinder tournament, but Pickwick is a wonderful lake. It's really kind of a cool place to have a big tournament like this because it's big, and you got they're letting people lock into Wilson, Kentucky Lake. You can run the Bay Springs. It's a complex playing field, and today was the final day of practice, so I'm ready to get started.
Awesome. All right. So everybody joining us, if you can let us know. I see Matthew's in from Corpus Christi. Let me know where you are tuning in from. We've had people from all over the world tuning into these things, and we do this every 2 weeks. We do these Shimano schools. We go back and forth between saltwater and freshwater. I know in the next, not this week coming, the week after, we're going to be doing a surf casting type talk with someone from South Padre Island. So that's not far from you, Keith. So we're going to be doing a bit of everything. There's Biff from Arkansas. So guys, we can see everything. And we're also going to do something a little different. We're trying a new platform tonight where I can actually overlay the chat so that we should be able to see stuff happening in this area here. I'm hoping. We're all playing a learning game. So, yeah, there we go. People saying you can see. So this will be a little more interactive. We are live on both our YouTube channel for Shimano North America and on the Facebook page. So why don't we get things rolling? We're talking. Wait, I think I've got something set up for this. This is going to be the topic tonight, folks. So if you're tuning in, Shimano School, and we're talking fall cranking with Keith Combs. So keep checking in. Let me know where you guys are coming in from. That helps me keep an eye on everything. And let's get things started, Keith. Fall cranking. Why is cranking so good in the fall?
Well, I think there's a couple reasons. One is probably they're just dialed in on bait. That's a typical thing on fall lakes. In particular, they're dialed in on shad on most of our lakes, and you can just imitate that forage so well with the crankbait. The other thing is, the water's cooling off, but it's still warm water. For me, that's the time when I like to fish a crankbait very fast, very aggressive. You can cover tons of water with that bait, and that's so important in the fall, especially like during your scouting, is because fall is usually all about very small areas hold all the fish. So you're covering water, looking for those little areas, those little subtleties, and a crankbait moving fast. There's no better way to cover that water.
And from shallow to deep, right? I mean, the way the crankings come along, there really is no water that the bass live in that you can't touch with it.
That's very true. Very very good point there. We have so many varieties of for everything from your lipless crankbaits, square bills, 1.5 type square bills, all the way to your 6XDs, 10XDs, your super deep divers, things like that. And and everything plays in the fall. Depending on the type of lake you go to, there's no depth that is ruled out in fall fishing, in my opinion. Until I get to the lake and start sizing things up with my electronics, it's a free for all.
Awesome. All right. So we've got people checking in from all over. Brandon from Mableton, Georgia. We got Richie Rogers from Connecticut. Pierre from San Diego on our YouTube channel. Hengen from Manitoba, Canada. We got Bill from Homosassa, Florida. I mean, Kingsport, Tennessee. Champlain. Fresno, California. New Brunswick, Canada. John's here from our John. We see John every other week here. He's one of our viewers from our YouTube channel. Charleston checking in. Colima, Mexico, Columbia, Connecticut, South Central Pennsylvania. I mean, all over the place. So I hope everybody's doing well. This is another Shimano School. We are talking fall cranking with Keith Combs. And we just touched on the fact why cranking is good in the fall. So, Keith, let's give people who haven't done a lot of cranking the step-by-step things that they need to know. And I want to start with when to pick up a crankbait. When, for Keith, when you're practicing or going to a lake, when is the time that you say conditions are good? Is it time of year? Is it bait? Is it, water conditions? What do you look for when it comes time to throw a crankbait?
Honestly, JP, it's such a versatile, especially when we talk about what we just talked about. I guess you would say that we have such a range of baits, nowadays when you get everything that dives from 2 foot of water to 25 foot of water. There's almost a cranking situation on any given lake. What I like to see is really fish that are relating to some kind of structural type drop off or something like that, like a channel edge or something like that in the fall. That's one of my very favorite type of situations. So, kind of I guess to explain it a little bit better, say you have a big creek and it's got one channel, an old creek channel that winds through it. When fish will relate to that kind of thing, like they do a lot in the fall, that's one of my favorite cranking situations is to, position my boat in that channel and fire that crankbait down the edges and fish all those channel bends and, whatever type of cover is available. And that's something about fall cranking is a lot of times they'll just be on a shell bed or a sandbar or something like that. Still talking warm water, in the fall, especially right now. So those fish they're not always cover related. They're just relating to a drop, using that drop to help them target shad.
All right. And now, so for those who don't fish around a lot of shad, now we have alewife up here in the north, especially around the Great Lakes areas, but we don't have a ton of shad. What is the deal with shad come fall time? Is it a spawn trigger? Is it a just move shallow because of the available warmer water? What is it?
Well, most of your southern reservoirs, shad is going to be your primary forage in the fall, just because you'll find them in the back of creeks at other times of the year, but fish like to just push them into the backs of creeks almost, I believe, in the fall. So it becomes a very easy target, and they'll stay on those shad on most of our lakes all the way through the winter. They may move out a little bit deeper into those channels and things like that. But, on most southern reservoirs, you're going to, and even, southeast, you're going to be targeting lakes that have shad. And very seldom will you find a good fall pattern when shad are not present.
Okay. So again, we're talking cranking, folks. I see a bunch of people from Montreal. Jason, what's going on? I've got a couple questions popping up about favorite reel and rod for cranking. So that's from the Champlain Fisher. We're going to be seeing all that, and we're going to be talking exactly about that. So let's start with the rod, which is probably the most important piece in the puzzle. Let's talk about cranking rods. We've all heard back in the day, I know when I started fishing, I was running glass rods, like literal glass rods. And technology's kind of got us beyond the big, heavy, clumsy rod to where we are now. What are the properties of a cranking rod? What makes a good cranking rod, Keith? And give people an example of what you're relying on in your arsenal.
Well, first off, I think, with cranking, the rod is probably, there's certain techniques that you could use a variety of different rods for, but cranking is one that I think you really need to be specific. And if you want to catch more fish and land more fish, you really need to get the proper equipment. For me, really the shortest rod that I like to go to is a 7.2 medium heavy glass. I use the Zodius rod a lot in my cranking. That 7.2 is a very versatile rod, because I can pick up a lipless crankbait or a square bill, and I'll use that same rod all the way through my deep divers up to say like an 18-foot diver, like a Strike King 6XD. Now, when I go deeper with a big heavy plug like a 10XD or something like that, maybe 8XD, then I'll go up to our Zodius 711. But the things that I think really make a good cranking rod is, you want a very parabolic rod. So you want flex throughout the rod, not just, a real beefy, heavy midsection and then a light tip. You want a rod that has flex throughout the rod. Two reasons for that. One is just your overall casting distance. You want to be able to do everything from a short little chip cast to a long bomb, and that glass rod is going to load up. But probably the most important thing is, for beginning crankers, you're gonna have a lot of trouble with lost fish, hooking fish and then losing them. Well, a lot of that's due to the rod, and believe me, I have learned that the hard way over years of losing fish. But just just to consider what happens, when you got a fish hooked. It's not a flipping hook. It's a treble, and it might be. Hopefully, you got two hooks in the fish, but a lot of times it's just one. So, what you're wanting that rod to do is really just conform to every movement that fish makes. So if he surges at you, or he comes up and jumps and shakes his head, keep the line tight, keep some pressure on that rod, and a good glass rod is gonna flex with that fish, and it's gonna keep him buttoned up. So that's what I'm looking for.
All right. And so you and I have talked about it earlier, and you always mentioned the size. So you're relying a lot on the 7'2" and the 7'11", or seem to be the two models. And we have a new 7'6" that's come out as well. So explain how the length will affect, or how you find it affects the cranking. I mean, I know for casting, a longer rod's always better. And when you're, maybe you're up in the tight creek and you're roll casting for accuracy, a shorter rod can be more accurate. Is that how you play your rods out?
It is a lot. A big long 7'11" rod. If you're in tight quarters, well, that's going to be tough. From everything from landing that fish, if you got a big one on, you got to go back and lip the fish. Like we don't get to use nets on my tour, but man, that's tough sometimes. But yeah, that's a situation where maybe like you're 7'2", but then if you're going to move out on a flat where it's just totally open water, and making those long casts are important, that's 7'11". But the new 7'6" is probably going to settle in as one that you can do kind of like the 7'2" is now. You can do a lot with that rod. Like I said, I use a 7'11" when I go do a big plug, but with a 7'6", if a guy doesn't want to, I would recommend eventually probably having several different lengths in your boat. But if you're going to start with one, probably that 7'2" or that 7'6" is going to cover a lot of bases.
Yeah. And again, I think it's important for people to understand that the crankbait diving depth is going to also reflect which rod you're going to pick, because there's everything from 7 foot, 7'2", 7'6", and 7'11", but they all are rated very differently as well, correct?
Right. And so that's really important to learn when you're cranking is generally, especially when you're targeting largemouth, you're going to want your crankbait to bump into something, whether it's the top of grass or a stump or just the bottom. So it's very important for a person to understand exactly how deep, crankbait goes. That way, okay, I'm in this situation. I can see fish on my electronics positioned in this depth, or the top, the top of the grass or the top of the brushes in this depth. You're going to know what crankbait to pick up and throw. And there are also things, that you can do with your rod to make slight adjustments. So just say, for instance, I'm going to throw a Strike King 6XD. I know on a general cast with 15-pound fluorocarbon line, that bait is going to dig to 18 or 19 feet. But, if I hold my rod up, and especially when you first begin the retrieve, when that bait is just starting to descend, you hold the rod up or hold it in the middle, you're going to be able to change that depth by a foot or two. So that's just another little pointer, and that goes the same on all crankbaits. So generally, most of the time you're going to crank with your rod tip down or straight out. But if you want to run it a little bit shallower, certain situation, cranking with that rod tip up is going to bring it up. So just something to keep in mind. But yeah, you really, really need to understand in the family of crankbaits that you're using, which ones to pick up in certain situations. And usually the number one indicator is how deep will that bait dive.
Yeah. And I've seen people take a medium power cranking rod and try to throw, a 6XD or something like, a big deep diving crankbait. And it gets to the point where the rod will actually, while you're cranking, be loaded so hard that it's at its maximum flex, and you got no give anymore for the fish to eat the bait, it feels like.
Exactly. And, if you're cranking like a diving plug and you're cranking it for the long haul. If you're committed to that pattern, and especially if you're fishing that bait fast, it's going to pull hard against that rod. So you want to match it with the right rod, and also, a lot of people will say, man, I see you throwing a deep crankbait a lot. How do you just keep from not wearing your forearm out? And a lot of that is about how you hold. Get the right equipment, number one, and just how you hold the rod. So you don't want to. A lot of times, if I'm really power cranking, I'm not pointing the rod directly at the bait, but I'm pointing it pretty much the direction my bait's going with the rod tip up just a little bit, and letting the reel do the work. I like to throw the Corrado DC, the 150. That's one of my favorite cranking reels, and it's a workhorse. But a 7.4 gear ratio, that's a fast reel, and it'll definitely pull hard. But if you let the reel do the work instead of your wrist do the work, just by the rod position, you'll be surprised about, really there's very little fatigue.
That's a great point. I mean, and you see it when people will bring their rod to the side, almost, away from the bait, keeping that tension. And my God, it's all forearm. You're taxing your forearm when you're reeling rather than what you're saying. So if anybody's picking up points from Keith tonight, the one you might want to pay attention to is pointing your rod basically at the bait and a little bit up or a little bit off of the straight line. Yeah. But it'll definitely reduce your fatigue. Absolutely. So let's answer a couple questions here, Keith, because they're piling in. Let's see. Favorite cranking rod. So Keith, you've talked about the fact that you're a 7.2 and a 7.11 from the Zodius lineup. People are asking about the difference between Zodius and X-Pride, actually. Here's one from Brandon over on Facebook. Why do you choose Zodius over X-Pride for cranking? And I know you've played with both. I've played with both. Is there a reason why you fall back on Corrado? Has it just been your comfort zone? You know what I mean? Like, what's the difference you find?
We have a very good X-Pride cranking rod. I think it just depends on maybe what a person wants. What I found is in that lower portion of the X-Pride line, they're a little bit of a heavier rod. Not a bad thing in some situations. So let's just say, for instance, you're taking a lipless crankbait and you're ripping it through grass or something like that. The X-Pride might be a better rod for that situation because it still has a very soft tip, but it has a lot more backbone down low. But a lot of my cranking, I'm wanting that backbone. I'm not wanting that backbone really stiff down low. Like I said, I want a very parabolic rod, and the Zodius kind of has that. Other situations that the X-Pride might shine in is, just say you're cranking a lake that has a lot of timber or something like that, where you really need to take control of a big fish and get him away from stuff. That X-Pride is going to give you a little bit more pull, a little bit more control, just because it's more rod. But for most of my cranking open water situations, that Zodius is my favorite. But again, I think it's just going to depend on. You can't go wrong with either one of those rods, honestly. But that's kind of what I see the difference in the two being.
Yeah, and from a technical standpoint between the two rods, they're both high power X blanks. The actual Zodius has the new monocoque handle, so I feel like it gives it a little bit of a leg up over X-Pride when it comes to sensitivity. When you got that handle up on your forearm, but X-Pride has a higher quality guide train. But really, it's a price point, but they're very similar. Construction, I find X-Pride to be a little lighter, a little faster. And that's probably why Keith's finding them a little heavier in that bottom section. But really, I don't think you can go wrong with either. And if price point is an issue, Zodius is phenomenal bang for the buck. I think they start at like $179 to $199, somewhere in there. And the new Corrado rods, which are $159 to $179, are another great option because they're available in a whole bunch of glass blanks. I think they have 6 glass rods as well, kind of to fill that void like we had from 7 foot to 7.2 to 7.5s, all the way up to 7'8". So, all right. So Brandon, hopefully that helps you out. Again, folks, we're doing Shimano School. My name is JP DeRose. We're here with BASS Elite Series angler Keith Combs and Shimano pro staffer. We're talking fall cranking. So I'll put my little neat little thing here. So for those of you just tuning in, this is Fall Cranking with Keith Combs. We've talked about rods so far, and we talked about why or when to do the cranking. But Keith just touched a little bit on reels, and we're answering questions. So if you have questions, I want you guys to put them in the comment. If you have a buddy who maybe isn't that good at cranking, maybe you got a buddy who loves nothing but cranking and would love to learn some more tips. I would love to see you guys tag them and share this post. That would help us out, get the word out. But your questions, we're going to try to get to them all tonight. So this is a good one. And between Keith and I, we should be able to handle this. This is from Mark over on our YouTube channel. He's saying compare X-Pride to Zodius and then to a graphite rod such as IMX Pro. But I think I want to add in Corrado. I have all the stats here. I've got an advantage over Keith because I have a second screen in front of me here. But Keith, when you're talking X-Pride Zodius glass rods, they are not a solid graphite blank, correct? They are a high power X graphite plus glass to get the action. Are they not?
Correct. That's correct. So, you know, a lot of the old glass rods were very dull feeling, which to me, you want to be able to be sensitive with your crankbait rod, but a good cranking rod is going to allow for that human error, especially when you're really burning a crankbait. So you want to know everything the crankbait's doing. You want to be able to detect the type of bottom end. You want to be able to know when fish comes up and just pushes at your bait. But you want that rod to keep you from pulling that bait away from a fish and let that fish eat that bait good before you really get you know, a hook set in him. And you do need to set the hook. I've heard some people say, man, with good cranking rod, you just start reeling faster and they'll hook themselves. But I find you need to pull on him. You need to pull on him a little bit. You know, we were talking earlier, kind of comparing the two Zodius versus X-Pride cranking rods in another question. And like I said, we have, especially when you start even going into the new Corrado line, we just have so many options. Most of my cranking over the past several years has been done with that Zodius 172 medium heavy and the 711 medium heavy glass. But you know, I almost feel like it sometimes at this point with our lineup, it becomes personal preference. There are other, you know, there are things like you mentioned how fast the X-Pride line is compared to the little bit slower action of the Zodius. If that's what you're looking for, you know, we have both models. A lot of times it's more about what you put in your hand and it just feels right.
All right. And then from the other side of this, obviously IMX Pro, the G Loomis family being part of the Shimano family, a very different blank than what you're getting, whether you're looking at Corrado rod or Zodius or X-Pride, which are all high power X with glass blanks. IMX Pro does something. They are blends as well, but they're using something called multi-taper design. So what I find when I compare the two, I find the IMX Pros to be a little more stiff in the backbone section, again, depending on the model, but I rely on the 906 casting, which is 7'6" heavy. And then I also rely a lot on the 711s. So the MH and the H. I like having big long rods because unlike Keith, I don't end up in a lot of creeks up here like casting cranks because it's clear water. It's open water for the most part when you're up north, you know, fishing Great Lakes region. And I want big, long casts. So for me, I pick a longer cranking rod all the time. But when I compare IMX Pro to Zodius or anything with high power X, I find them, because of multi-taper design, I find them a little more responsive on the tip, a little snappier on the tip. Like you can really twitch your bait out of grass really easily with them, and they lock up real solid on the hook set. But when you're fighting the fish, that's where that multi-taper comes in and the rods become super parabolic. So a little bit different feeling. They really are different. And the best thing I can tell anybody is if you want to try them both out, compare them, put the same reel, the same bait, the same pound test line on them, and fish the two rods. Even between Zodius, X-Pride, and Corrado rod. If you have a good store that you work with or know or you shop at, or you have a buddy who happens to be a pro staff member on Shimano or has a lot of Shimano rods and reels, try it out like that. But compare apples to apples. My opinion of a IMX Pro may be completely different than Keith's because the way Keith fishes. Every person is different. So, all right. This one is a really good one, actually, and this will help. This is all you, Keith. So Pia is asking, what line size will you pair each different rod? So let's talk your 7.2 setup versus if you had a 7.6 setup and then your 7.11 setup.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't use a lot of different line sizes when cranking. Typically, a standard cranking line for me is a 15-pound fluorocarbon line, and but I will vary in certain situations. So let's just say, you know, I'm cold water cranking or a little bit cooler later in the fall type of stuff like that. A lot of times I'll drop down to a lighter line, like a 12-pound line with a small bait. You know, the lighter you can go with your line, the more lively your bait is always going to be. So, you know, we talk about, you know, bumping cover with a crankbait or something like that to get that deflection. Always keep that in mind, that the heavier that you have to go with your line, the less deflection, and to me, the less natural your crankbait is going to work through cover. But the reverse side to that is if you get too light, you're going to break off fish. So we're talking about cranking around rocks or wood or something like that. And you're banging that bait into that stuff constantly. You want to check your line, but you know, a 12 or 15-pound line is really a good base for cranking. If you get too light, well, you're just going to run into lots of issues with nicks in your line that, you know, maybe you just don't detect in time. So, and it's so as a standard rule, for most of my cranking, I can get by with 12 to 15. Sometimes I'll upscale to 17. The main thing that I think a person's got to always consider there is the bigger the diameter line you have to go to, it's always going to deaden the action of that bait.
And so the big debate that's on the I think you use Seaguar, do you not, Keith?
I do.
Are you a Seaguar guy?
Mm-hmm.
There's so many brands of line on the market, right? And there's so much variance. It aggravates me as an angler because I find a 10-pound test from one manufacturer is not a 10-pound test from the other, because they're not basing it on diameter. They're basing it on whatever they want to call the strength of the line is. But not all lines are really equal, are they? Like,
No.
Certain diameter lines are thinner than others at the same pound test. Is that correct? And how does that affect cranking?
That's absolutely true. You know, so I use a Seaguar Invisex, and I say that, you know, I use 15-pound, but you may pick up another manufacturer's line, and it's a bigger diameter. So with that brand, you might want to drop to a 12 or something like that, or 10. But with that Seaguar, you know, I wish I knew the exact. I probably should know the exact diameter.
10, I know 10 is 0.010.
All right.
I think 14 is 0.12. So probably 0.13, somewhere around there would be your 15, but I can check while you're figuring it out.
Yeah. So, but it's amazing. You know, we're only talking a very. I mean, man, you can hardly with the eye, you can barely tell the difference between 15 and 17-pound line, but you can certainly tell it in the way your bait reacts. Not so much, you know, when we used to crank with mono way back in the day, that's what everybody used, 10-pound mono. Monofilament greatly affected the depth of your bait because it floated it and it wanted to pull your bait to the surface. Fluorocarbon lines generally are very slow sinkers, so it's not as big of a factor. But the thing I always caution people when they talk about line sizes is really just the action you're getting out of your crankbait.
0.13 is Seaguar 15-pound, Keith. So yeah. And it will make a difference. Absolutely. I know this for even the depth of the baits. For myself, when I'm fishing cover, I'm usually 14-pound to 16-pound. I use a straight fluorocarbon or a cranking fluorocarbon just because I feel like it's a little more sensitive, a little less stretch. But more importantly, up here, we have zebra mussels. So when I'm doing a ton of deep cranking around big boulders, I want that 15, 14, or 16-pound test because I'm going to rub the bottom 12 inches of that bait when I'm cranking bottom across a rock that's just absolutely covered in zebra mussels. So I find it does a little bit better of a job. Now, what about, let me pop this thing off, this comment. What about braid? Now, I hear a lot of guys in specific special circumstances will use like a 20 or 30-pound braid because you can get more depth out of your bait. Have you ever done it, and have you adjusted your rod because of the lack of stretch in braid?
Really, I've had to use braid. I can remember one tournament we had on the Arkansas River, and something about the rocks there, they were worse than zebra mussels. I mean, they nicked your line constantly. I had to go to a 30-pound braid just to keep from breaking fish off. And then back when I was fishing Falcon Lake a lot around cover, square billing around cover, and man, the fish were huge. I mean, we're catching 8-pounders on a consistent basis and having a chance to catch one much bigger than that. Then you really had to use like a 40-pound braid. But the thing is, that's just because of the cover, that situation. But I do find that braid is always going to be a lot less forgiving, even with a great cranking rod that's going to flex with that fish. Just that rigidness of a braided line always makes me a little bit uncomfortable. A fluoro doesn't have much stretch. It doesn't, compared to a mono, it's night and day. But it's still, if you pull on just a 12-inch piece of fluorocarbon, you'll notice that there's an inch of stretch that you can get out of it with your bare hands. So I kind of like having that real fast stretch of fluoro. Just
Yep.
I gotta land every fish, to get paid, and so braid scares me.
Okay, and it's just a great point for people who are new to cranking. I see it happen a lot. I get a lot of emails. People will be like, "Oh, I'm cranking and I'm losing a lot of fish," and they'll say, "Well, I'm using braid," and well, it's because you have no stretch. I mean, the whole purpose of a crankbait, any bait that's moving, a fish gets up behind it, and they tend to suck water in when they eat the thing. If you have no stretch in your line and you have a stiff rod that's not designed for cranking, you've got two strikes against you right away.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Like the fish is not going to get as much of that bait in their mouth, and that's when if you start noticing your lip hooking on the back every time consistently, it's not just a funk they're in, it could be your setup that's causing it.
Yeah, a very, very good point. And braid is ultra sensitive. We were talking about that a little bit earlier. You want your setup to allow for that human error. And a lot of times, especially anytime your rod is loaded, if you're cranking fast, that rod is loaded. When something touches it, it's just human nature to pull. You're going to pull. So just it's the small things. Just the difference between braid and fluorocarbon. Just a little bit difference in sensitivity. Just a little bit more stretch. It's just going to help you to catch more fish.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's another point. So we've talked rods now and we've talked line. We're going to talk reels next. For everybody who's tuning in, welcome to another Shimano School. My name is JP DeRose. We're here with Keith Combs, Bassmaster Elite Series angler, who is getting ready for an open on Pickwick Lake. And he's saying the fishing is kind of tough right now, but hopefully Keith gets them in the next few days. Starts tomorrow, the tournament. Folks, if you're putting your questions in, I'm starting to see them now. I got a few more to get to. Again, just place them in the comment. Welcome to everybody on both our YouTube channel and our Facebook channel. So this is every 2 weeks. This is Shimano School. And let's just keep plowing through questions. Let's talk reels, Keith. You mentioned Corrado DC is your go-to workhorse reel. Corrado K has been, out for quite a few years now, a best of show winner, but is a staple in bass fishing world. And then there's also the Corrado 300s that have play in this world as well. So explain to me, people are asking about gear ratios. Do you guys use a 7 gear like the Champlain Fisher's asking? Talk about your gear ratio, and if you're using 15, why is it good to have a 150 size reel?
Well, I use a 7 almost exclusively. But there are certain situations where a guy might want to drop to a slower gear ratio if he wants to slow his bait down. And, sometimes we just get out there and we find ourselves winding way too fast, like for cold water or something like that. But if you can just consciously make yourself slow down when you need to, what I really like about a 7 is it puts me in control fighting that fish. So, just say you have a fish bite close to the boat, he surges at the boat, you can pick up line so much faster with a 7. Um, and it is very important. It's very important for fighting the fish to be able to control that, that reel speed, whether that fish is surging at you or surging to the surface. You got to keep your line tight when you're fighting a fish on a crankbait. That's very important. So for most situations, I'm using the 7, even if I'm not reeling fast. And I can change up. I can reel slow half the retrieve. I can reel fast half the retrieve. If I need to get my bait in really fast, if I see some fish blowing up or something like that, I can really lean on it with that 7 and get it on in close to the boat real quick.
All right. And for those of you who are familiar with Shimano reels or unfamiliar with them, every one of our bait casters that we come out with now from SLX up is basically available in 3 gear ratios and left and right-handed. So whether you're a southpaw or you're not, it does not matter. But when you're looking for a reel, people often ask about the models. There's a specific naming on the reels that will tell you what the reel, if the reel says like this, Corrado 300, this would be the low speed. Okay, if it would say 300 HG, that would be what Keith is talking about. That is a 7-to-1, 7.2-to-1, 7.4-to-1, depending on the model. But that is the 7-to-1 gear ratio reel. And then if it says XG beside the name, that is the high speed 8-to-1 reels. So depending on the model, could be an 8-1-to-1 up to 8-5-to-1. But when you're looking at them, if Keith says he throws a Corrado DC 150, it's an HG. He's running the 7 model. So when it comes to inches of line per handle turn, Keith, let's talk about that with reels. Growing up, I remember throwing 4.3-to-1s. I mean, right? And 5-to-1 was the standard. We do have a 5-to-1 Corrado PG power gear that is available as well. How big of a difference does going from 21 inches of line per handle turn to 35 inches of handle turn per handle turn make on cranking?
Oh, it's a big deal. I think it not just for like we're talking about, not just for controlling the speed of your bait, but when you got the fish hooked up, it's a big deal to be able to, you got to conform to what the fish is doing, and every fish is going to go their own way. So to me, that's a really big benefit. And yes, I mean, I remember everything was slow back, when I started fishing too. And I can't tell you how many fish, just came up and jumped, and I still had, my line. So if you got a bait that's down in 18 foot of water and a fish comes to the top as fast as he can, it's very hard with a slow reel not to have that big bow in your line. Your line's still down, but the fish is on the top, and you'll lose that fish 90% of the time when he jumps. So that high speed reel, and I don't use faster than a 7 very often, but for me, I've settled on for most of my cranking on that 7.4. A lot of times it's that I really like a Corrado DC, the 150. I'll go to the 200 for line capacity. It's an awesome reel. But the DC, the technology in the DC has just made my life so easy. I can hold enough line, enough 15-pound line for most situations, but I can cast with the winds or I can cast into the wind. And that's such a big deal as far as boat positioning goes, because, used to casting into the wind was you're not going to get any distance. So you had to kind of position your boat upstream, and with DC, I can position my boat like I want to and fish all around that piece of, structure. And I'm in the driver's seat, no matter what the conditions are, no matter what the wind is doing.
And that's a big point, because the fish typically, if it's wind driven, there is a current created by wind, and oftentimes they'll position facing into the wind. You're a lot better bringing your crankbait at them than up from behind them.
Yes.
So what are your settings on DC? I'm interested to know how you set it up. What number are you using? Are you adjusting the spool tension on the reel, or are you keeping it where there's no side to side play like recommended? How do you set up your DC for casting into the wind, for those who don't know?
Yeah, usually I believe I'm on a 2, and
Yep.
And I back that back the brake off to where I got a little bit of wobble in that spool, and then I can adjust, either adjustment depending on the conditions. If I really want to back it off, I don't have much wind, I can always just do a slight turn, very very slight adjustment. Or if I got to cast into the wind, maybe I'm going to ramp it up just a little bit. But the reel is just really going to it just takes out the human error. I mean, I can air it out into a 15-mile-an-hour wind. Now, you may not want to throw high. You may want to try to more sidearm. But that's something that, before DC, we couldn't do at all. So it's really, like I said, it's just you want to be able to position your boat like you want to be able to position your boat, whether it's the angle you want to come off the drop, or you made a very great point there. Generally, if it's possible, you want to kind of crank with the current. Most things, like at Pickwick here, we have a very strong current in this lake. It's very natural for that fish to look for its prey coming down with the current. If you watch a school of shad, like we're fishing in a tail race today, we're watching schools of shad come down with the current. Only natural to bring your bait that way. Not saying they won't eat it the other way sometimes, but if you have an option, you want to be bringing your bait down with the current, down with the wind, and that's just something DC lets you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who haven't tried it, I mean, traditionally with the DC reels, there's 4 settings that make things super easy. You don't have to go in and adjust the variable braking or the SVS infinity braking like you would on a Corrado K or on a Bantam or on a Metanium. Because of that DC microcomputer, you can set it to number 1, which has the least amount of help from the computer. 2, where Keith is using it at, is it's helping. It's a setting we recommend for braid or for seasoned thumbs with fluorocarbon. And Keith obviously fishes for a living, so he has a fairly seasoned thumb. And then number 3 is what we recommend for fluoro use, because fluoro tends to get a little loose on the spool after repeated casting if you're new to fishing. And then number 4 is the most help basically from the microcomputer, where it's going to make those infinite braking adjustments, making sure your spool doesn't overspin. So if you have not checked out a DC reel, you may want to. They're kind of a big deal. They're pretty cool.
They're very cool. And, I think it's something I know that, I've done some guiding and stuff over the years. A lot of people that are new to bass fishing are intimidated with a bait caster because they picked one up 10 years ago and they threw a huge bird's nest. But you can put a DC on 4 and start there. And it's going to get you used to that bait caster. Then you can slowly start backing it off. So, I use one because it makes my life easy. But for the guy who's just learning that skill of throwing a bait caster, the DC has changed the game.
Now, I know being a Texas boy, you are not shy from throwing big, deep diving baits like your 6XD, or if we're talking about, any of the new stuff, big, deep diving crankbaits that pull super hard. Corrado 300, I remember, was brought out last fall. A bigger version of the Corrado K200, okay? But really, if you can notice, I got pretty big mitts, but I could take this reel and basically hide it in my hand. So it is a low-profile 300 size bait caster. When does something like this come into play? Is this something you're looking for like on a 7-Eleven rod that you're using strictly for like 19+ foot divers?
Absolutely. For your big plugs, big rod like that, the 200 is good. The 300 is a good option too. And it's not, like you say, it holds a lot of line. It's going to be great for airing those big plugs out in open water, and for a lot of other baits too. Your big swim baits, things like that you're going to be making those long power casts. That big handle's nice too. You're really in the driver's seat with that reel. But for like your 10XDs or something like that, when you want to just, or even say like a 6XD, when you want to get really deep, when you want to get those baits down in that 20+ foot range, that line capacity, that big spool on that 300 is going to let you air that thing out.
And just so you guys know the differences between the 3. So we've talked about the Corrado DC, which is a 150 size spool, the Corrado K, which has a 200 size spool, and the Corrado 300, which has a 300 size spool. If we're talking 14-pound rating, 14-pound line, the Corrado DC is going to hold 90 yards, which is almost a football field. I mean, if you're throwing a crankbait, a football field, you're pretty good at it. That's getting it out there. If you move to a Corrado K, which has the 200 size spool, you can hold 110 yards. But you talk about that 300, it will hold 180 yards of 14 pounds. So it has double the line capacity of that Corrado 150. So as Keith mentioned, when you need to get it out, I know there's a technique they use in Texas, deep flex cranking, right? Where you guys are bringing those crankbaits and strolling them down on ledges super deep.
Right. Yeah. So it's basically to get a crankbait extremely deep and keep it there for a long period of time. You'll make your cast, get on the trolling motor, let line out. You're not reeling. Your crankbait's just sitting there. I mean, you may have 100 yards of line out, and then you start winding. So that what it does is it lets a crankbait that would normally run 15 foot deep go 30 foot deep. So not only is it a technique to get to extreme depths, but also it's a technique to take a small crankbait. Say the fish don't want to bite something big. You can take a small crankbait and you can get it down there deep. Unfortunately, it's such a good technique, we can't use it in competition, but it's something I would recommend.
If you've never done it,
I actually did win a really big Texas Bass Classic on Lake Fork and used that technique back before it was being an outlaw. So very, very good technique, and that's a very good situation where that 300 is going to shine. And also, generally when I talk cranking, I talk 15-pound line as a base. In a situation where a guy says, I got to use 20, or I got to use braid for this application, well, that 300 will shine there with that bigger diameter line.
Yeah, absolutely. 14-pound and 180 yards of it. I do it for smallmouth here all the time. I do it for Chinook salmon when I'm cranking. I get my cranks down that normally on a cast might hit 17 or 18. So if I'm throwing like a Diggle 5+, in your case, it would be probably a 6XD. I can get them to strike bottom in 36, 38 feet of water and stay down there pounding the whole time. Right. But if you're going to do that, fluorocarbon's a must, because you're going to invariably run across rocks, brush, and all kinds of other stuff that the fish are living on. All right. So this one's a good question. I like this one. We just talked about line and gear ratio, but people saying, does a leader not make up for using braid? So how much leader would you say might make a difference, Keith? Because a little short piece really isn't going to make up for the lack of stretch in 180-foot cast from braid. Would you recommend putting a longer piece on?
I would probably try to stay away from. To be honest with you, I mean, I use a leader a lot, like with a top water or something like that, just to keep it from fouling up with braid. And I tie a very, very short piece. I don't like, I usually tie a double uni knot. It's fairly small knot. They have some other knots, like a YG knot, I believe it's called. And,
FG knot?
It shows you how much I tie that knot. But like you said, it's still going to go through your guides. And if you're really bombing a crankbait, especially on a rod with a lot of flex, it's going to want to catch that guide.
Yeah.
Not saying it's a total no, but I think you're going to struggle. Firing that crankbait real hard with that knot all day long.
Yeah, I agree. I would just have a setup that has fluorocarbon. And if you are a person who just loves using braid like Power Pro, my suggestion would be go to a softer rod. Go to one rod softer than you would normally use with a fluorocarbon, because I find that does help. It's not going to be as good as the proper weight and length rod with fluorocarbon, but the next best thing to do is go to like that moderate one step lighter rod when you're using braid, to kind of give you a bit more absorption when you're cranking with something that has zero stretch like braid. So my 2 cents on that one. Keith's saying don't do it. Just use fluorocarbon.
Well, yeah, or either or.
Let me put you up here, Keith, so I don't have your face crossed. All right, Mark's asking, do you prefer a larger handled reel like such as on the Corrado versus smaller handle on Bantam? Speak of the aspects of handle sizes and how they play on cranking. That's a great question, actually.
It is, and I like a big power handle. It just feels more comfortable to me. I guess it boils down to a lot about personal preference, but for me, for cranking, I really like, the big handles that we have on the Corrados.
What is it about them, Keith, that you love so much? Does a bigger handle make it easier to
I
crank?
think in some situations it makes it easier to find your handle when you're pitching or something like that, and you may not have both hands on your rod and reel all the time. Um, I find that if I can find it real quick and find where I need to position my hand for a hook set or start reeling on a fish, but I gotta say it's more of almost a personal preference type of deal. I just like for me, I like that big handle.
Yeah, and I agree. I don't think a smaller handle is going to be any harder to reel in a bait than a larger handle is, just because of the reels being built with X ships. So they're double bearing supported pinion gears, micro module 2 gearing in some of them. All the little things that make a Shimano reel do really well at handling torque, whether it's a 150 size or a 300 size. I've never noticed that my Bantams that have that smaller, uh, length handle to be any harder to reel stuff. I think, like he said, if you like a smaller handle, use a smaller handle. If you don't, and you can always call our parts department and order a bigger handle, because the handles are pretty much universal across the reels. I do know that the XGs on the Corrado Ks, I believe, have a wider handle than, let's just say, a regular 6-to-1 reel. There are specific models that have bigger handles. So if you are looking for one, it is available usually for the reel. All right. This one, Champlain Fisher's asking, why didn't Shimano put micro module in the Corrado 300? I have no idea why the reasoning was. I just know that it has not affected the feel. I mean, listen, the feel of micro module is hard to beat. Once you fish micro module reels, whether it's Metanium, Bantam, Corrado, whatever it is a smoother gear because of the smaller teeth and more meshing, rather than having, that big chunky gear that we used to have. You get this and it's smoother, but I have no idea as to the technical aspect as to why. There's always a reason. If I sit down and talk to one of the reel engineers, they'll give me a pretty good reason as to why. It may also be because they're using the same gears from Trank's 300, which would make a lot of sense from an engineering standpoint. So wish I had a better answer for you there, Champlain Fisher. I love this one. John's asking, you don't have access to a boat. How can you approach crankbait fishing from shore?
Well, you can certainly do it. It's a lot. One of the things that I struggle with. We pond fish some around the house, and we actually have a pond close to on our property, and I like to make contact with a crankbait, especially around wood and things like that. So you're going to get hung. The nice thing about a boat is you can go get it off, so you're not shy to make those kind of cast where you're going to be deflecting off wood. You'll have to shy away from that type of cast when you're fishing from the bank, just because you don't want to lose your good crankbaits all the time. But you still will basically do things the same. I'm just a lot less likely to cast around wood and things like that from the bank. But pretty much I think your applications are going to be the same from the boat as the bank.
Is there length of rod, Keith, that would help? Like longer rods, obviously longer casting. Certain reels better at casting. Should you be looking for certain setups, things? Because if you're stuck on the shore, you're obviously going to want to reach further out. Correct?
I think you're going to want to have more options. Whether you want to be tight or you want to go way out. It's just not as easy to move around like it is in a boat and position yourself differently. So that's a very good point that you made, JP. I think maybe that's a situation where if you're going to buy a new cranking rod, maybe something like our 711 would give you, you'd still be able to fish tight, but you would also be able to make those big long casts. Maybe go with a 200 size spool, something like that. That way you have a lot more options if you're going to be kind of isolated to fishing, in one general area. You can go way out, you can stay tight. So that might be a very good suggestion.
The other thing I can say to you, John, is to me, a crankbait is any bait that's kind of shad shaped or minnow shaped that wiggles back and forth when you reel it. And a wake bait is probably one of the best shore baits that you can throw. Just be careful when you're picking your baits, because like Keith said, you're not gonna be able to go get them. And as that bait gets reeled back to shore, that's when it's going to start hitting its deepest depths. But unfortunately, you're running out of water as you come back, right? The water's going to get shallower as you reel into shore. It's not like we would be casting at the shore and the diving pitch of that bait would follow the depth contour from shore coming out to us. You're the opposite. You're casting to the deeper part, starting your reeling, and then when that bait's finally hit its maximum depth, it's starting to come back up the shoreline. So just be careful you pick the right depth crankbaits. Just realize that they're available from wake bait, which I mean literally will sit right under the surface creating a wake, all the way down to 25 plus foot now, right, Keith? I mean, every single one is available. Yep. Someone fishing from shore, Keith, should they be a little more in tune with maybe what the forage is in the bait just to match better shape and profile? Like when you're picking a crank, what do you look for? Are you looking to match the bait that they're feeding on, or is there certain things like colors you love?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's always important to understand what the fish are feeding on, but I don't feel like it's really that important to try to match the size or the color. Simply because I think sometimes it's better to kind of stand out. So if everything is a 2-inch shad and they all look the same, something that stands out oftentimes will get the attention of a bass. And it's just so hard to compete with Mother Nature. I mean, we have a lot of color options, but it's very hard to make that fish believe that that's a shad. But what I do think is important when I talk about understanding the forage is, if you're on a lake and they're feeding on crawfish versus shad, or emerald shiners versus gobies or something like that, well, that really affects where that fish is generally going to get his meal. So if you're fishing a lake with gobies or crawfish or something like that, you probably know that fish is targeting the bottom. Whereas if you're fishing a lake, that has emerald shiners or something like that, or it's shad and it's a hot, slick fall day and those shad are rising to the surface, that might mean you want to work that upper portion of the water column a lot more. So understanding the forage is very important to understand exactly what depth range you want to choose to fish. But again, I think being creative with colors, and fish will tell you when you got things right. They'll eat your bait good when you got the right color and you got the right size. So always be very, very in tune with the way a fish eats your bait.
Very observant, for sure.
Very observant. Yep.
Yeah, and that's a phenomenal point, Keith. Honestly, the way they're eating the bait, take this one down. You guys should be writing this down. The way they're eating that bait lets you know if you're dialed in. So if they're lipping it a lot, then maybe you don't have the color right, or maybe you don't have the profile right, or maybe the size. Could even be the rattles. It could be a one knocker versus a silent. That could make all the difference in the world. And that's what makes cranking so interesting. And that's why not everybody's really good at it. It's very intricate. It's very detail oriented.
It is. And like we talked about earlier, I think really paying attention, it's not just throwing it out there and reeling it in. You need to be able to feel that bait and pay attention to what it's doing all the time, because a lot of times I have had, I can't tell you how many times it happens on almost a daily basis. I call it a push bite. So a fish approaches your bait, and you don't feel a bite, you don't hook a fish, but it almost feels like that bait just surged
You
at
went
you.
slack. You could just go slack.
Yeah, yeah, and it may not totally go slag, but it pushes at you enough where you feel like something just flushed behind the bait. Well, a lot of times that is a very important piece of the puzzle. If you're getting that consistently, you're doing something wrong, and it could be like you say, JP. It could be retrieve speed, it could be color, it could be rattles, it could be size or action, but change. When you're not getting good results, cranking, change something immediately.
Yeah. Some more great advice there. This one's a quick question. Jose on our YouTube channel is asking, is there a reel that works for both freshwater and saltwater? I mean, Keith is a Texas guy, so he's got the intracoastal waterways. He's got all that great inshore fishing not far from him, but spends most of your time is on freshwater, correct, Keith?
Most all the time, we make 1 or 2 trips salt every year, and I use the same equipment. I think it's very important that you clean it off, flush it out with some fresh water if you're going to do that. But for me, I don't fish salt too often. But yeah, 1 or 2 days I do spend in the salt. I use the same equipment and just clean it off.
Yeah, there's no stopping you from using a Corrado K or any of our reels, really. I would say if our reels are magnesium, try to keep them away from the salt because magnesium and salt does not play well. But Corrado G and Tranks are both specifically designed for the salt. And what they've done is they've just added, whether it's a drain port in certain areas or they remove X ships, so because those extra bearings are susceptible to salt intrusion. Those are the 2 reels that are really designed, but you'll have no problem using any of the reels. Just like Keith mentioned, maintenance is going to be king. You will destroy a reel in no time. Do not take your reel and get the hose and power spray it into the reel, because what you will force is any salt that's in the cracks, you'll drive that into the reel itself. A light misting always does a better job at taking the salt off your reels than you would be hitting them hard with water. I just throw mine in the shower. I take the rods and reels, put them in the shower when I saltwater fish, and hose them down in the shower and let them drain in there. I make sure my guides get done because the guides will rust as well. If there's any metal in your reel seat, you want to make sure you take care of that as well. Where are we going here? This is a question for both of us here, Keith. We've actually been talking for an hour, so we're going to take a few more questions, folks. Unbelievably, we have ripped through another hour here at Shimano School. Keith, you're okay to take on a couple more questions here?
Absolutely.
All right, awesome. So Mark's asking from you, what's your favorite Strike King crank and why? And then for me, he wants to know my favorite Jackal crank. So you got the floor, Keith.
Wow, it's a hard one to answer because it's different crankbaits for different situations. But some of my favorites, say I'm going to target fish that are in the depth range of say 3 to 7 foot. A Strike King 1.5 is a workhorse for me. But I love a 5XD for when those fish are in that 12 to 15 foot range, and I love my 6XDs when they get out there in that that 17 to 19 foot range. Those are probably my 3 favorite crankbaits.
All right. And for me, Mark, if I had to pick on Jackal side, I'm a huge believer in the MC60 MR and SR. I think only the MR is back right now. They haven't reintroduced the SR yet. So the MR is like a 5 to 7 foot diver, small profile, weighs, I think it's 3/8 of an ounce, but casts like a bullet. That is one that I use for smallmouth and largemouth from 3 feet of water down to like 6 or 7 feet of water. And then I've been playing a lot with the new Diggle, which is the new crank from Jackal. And it comes in a 2+, a 4+, and a 5+. And I believe the 5+ will touch 17, 18. So very comparable to probably a 6XD kind of diving depth. The uniqueness about the Diggle is it's actually got a coffin lip that is curled up on the edges. So it's flat across the middle, and the lip actually curls up. So it digs and funnels the water up the crankbait. So it's kind of cool. I did a couple shows with it this year, and it works great. I think with cranks, you find what you're confident in. There's a ton of them that work on the market. There's a lot of really great crankbaits, but I think you're going to be better at it if you're set up properly. rather than saying, I'm going to take my flipping stick and chuck a crankbait or a square bill around. Set yourself up if you want to really get good at cranking. It's going to help a lot. Let's see what we got here. Brandon's asking. All right. So Brandon's asking, he fishes deep, clear herring lakes in South Lake Lanier. How do you approach them fishing a crankbait?
Oh, great question, Brandon. I've actually fished Lanier. We had an elite series there in the pre-spawn a couple years ago, and I caught all of my fish cranking, and actually had a great finish, third place in that tournament. And I was cranking a Strike King 5XD, and I was cranking a Strike King 3XD in that tournament. It was mostly a morning bite, but I'd catch a couple key fish later in the day, and it was cold water. But I still actually started with a slow retrieve in practice because it was, I think water temperature was in the upper 40s, but the spots were really wanting a speed approach. So as practice kind of told me, I started to get some bites on some faster retrieves, and by the time the tournament came around, even in that cold water with those big spots, I was able to fish the bait fast. So that might be something to keep in mind. I think spotted bass are a little bit different than largemouth and smallmouth, and I don't get to target them nearly as much as I would like to. But what I found on those cold water spots where a largemouth would prefer a slower retrieve, that spot was still okay with that fast retrieve in that clear water in Lanier.
Yeah, I fished Lanier with my good buddy Ryan Coleman from Spot Sticker Baits and SOB Lures, and we did a show there. And it's a spot is an amazing animal because you could throw a jerkbait over a tree in 27 feet of water, and you won't get 2 pulls on it, and they'll rip the rod out of your hands. I mean, they are very, very upward, like suspended bait chasing fish, but also eat on the bottom because they love a shaky worm. So they're very, I find them to be like a mix between a smallmouth and a largemouth is the way I kind of see them as a northerner.
Well, that was true in that tournament. You mentioned that, JP, that a lot of times I'm always geared, I guess, from growing up fishing all of these southern places. Crankbait's got to touch something. It's got to touch something on every retrieve because so many times that triggers that largemouth to bite. I find that that's not important at all with smallmouth. They'll bite a crankbait in the middle of the water column, and also in Lanier, I was cranking over main lake ledges. And I was choosing my baits, basically the 5XD early in the morning, the 3XD later in the day, but I wasn't cranking the bottom. Those spots would come up and just take it out of the middle of the water column. Very different kind of cranking than I'm used to, but it was cool.
Yeah, I agree. I believe, honestly, a suspended crankbait gets bit better by a smallmouth than one that's cracking the bottom. It's not that they won't eat it when it's banging bottom, but it's not that they won't eat it when it's not. I think don't be afraid to throw a 7-foot diver over 12 feet of water, because if they're coming up for a jerkbait, they'll have no problems coming up for a crank. The only thing I find I do when I'm fishing those suspended cranks is I'll do little cadence bumps with the reel every so often, rather than having the bait do a steady dig all the way across the water column. I'll get like a little pause or a twitch or a fast crank down on the handle just to get that bait to either come off center or stall and maybe pause or do something a little bit different to try to get an aggravation strike out of them.
Yeah, still a little bit of reaction, but yeah, those fish with those lakes where they're feeding on emerald shiners or they're feeding on herring, I think those fish are always geared to look up. Yeah. But so you're not going to be able to bang the cover, but a quick jerk of the rod or quick snap of the reel or something, if one's behind it, it might get him to commit.
It's interesting. The northern fishery has changed so much in the last bunch of years because of gobies. Because prior to gobies, jerkbaits were king in the northern fisheries. And it's not that they don't work anymore. I just find like because the food source has become such a bottom dwelling food source. When I first started, crayfish were all the rage. And then, so the fish were looking down, and then emeralds and smelt and herring and alewife in our lakes here became the rage. So the fish's attention span was more focused higher in the water column or upwards. And now with gobies, all of a sudden things that didn't work for a bunch of years really well are starting to work again. It's like the evolution of the food chain that happens up here.
It really is. And we see it every year when we have back-to-back tournaments, sometimes on Champlain versus Thousand Islands, and you go same smallmouth, but one place they're looking up and one place they're looking down, an hour away.
Absolutely. All right. Last one we can comment on here. Champlain Fisher saying, do you know when the Shimano World Minnow will come out? Also, do you think there will be a new Cronarch out sometime soon? So I have not heard anything about a new Cronarch, but I will tell you this. If you follow Shimano hard enough, if you keep an eye on the reels as they come out, which new models have come out over the years, usually reels will live a certain amount of years, but there is a pecking order of what gets changed out. Last year, I know Corrado BFS came out. The year before that, Metanium was replaced. You know what I mean? So new SLX came out. So there is a overlap in time. You can actually keep an eye saying, well, which one hasn't been done yet since the last gen? And that'll give you a good idea of when. So I would say soon. Cronarch has been around for a while now, the last generation, the MGL. So I don't know for sure, but I would say within the next 2 years, I would say we probably see a new Cronarch. As for World Minnow, there we go. Late November. There's the comment from our friends at Shimano North America Fishing. Late November. Obviously, supply chain issues. We could talk about it in every part of our life right now. COVID has definitely damaged the supply chain. I know that fishing has seen a bigger increase in participation than we have ever seen at one time. There's been more new anglers brought into the sport, which has put more taxing on inventory. So you add a supply chain issue with a supply and demand issue. You know, it's been pretty hard for a lot of people to find stuff. I know, Keith, you're probably seeing the same thing in your end. It's just insane, but hopefully we'll hit market late November. But I think it was a supply chain issue because this bait was released at ICAST, both baits, both the diver and the minnow, but just not getting them here fast enough. I mean, it's just it's insanity. I don't even know what to say. It's a crazy deal. But anyways, folks, there you have it. Keith, you got anything you want to close with or anything like that?
Man, I've enjoyed all the questions, and I know there's probably a few more out there. Guys, if you send me a question on Facebook, I'll always do my best to answer it. So you can just Keith Combs Fishing on Facebook, and I love to talk fishing. So just if we didn't get to all the questions, just please send me a message on that, and I'll do my best to get it answered when I get home from this tournament. But thanks again. I've enjoyed all the questions, and I love to talk fishing with you guys. That's all I got, JP.
That's awesome, Keith. Thanks so much. Always appreciate your knowledge on when you do it. Hopefully we'll get to do this again. Maybe come springtime, we will get another one going. Folks, for all you who tuned in, thank you very much. We appreciate it. This is Shimano School. We do this every 2 weeks. Come back in 2 weeks. Let us know also if you guys like the new platform, if things were good, if the video was clear, if it was audio was good. We are searching for a new platform. So this was done on Restream. We're going to keep trying new stuff and try to make things a little more interactive for you guys. So until I see you guys in 2 weeks, thanks very much. Keith, good luck in the tournament. Hope you win it this weekend.
Sounds good. Thanks, JP.
All right. Everybody have yourself a great night. We will talk to you soon. Stay safe.